When Argentina defaulted on its debt in 2001, headlines screamed about government corruption and economic mismanagement. When Greece collapsed in 2010, the world blamed lazy workers and generous pensions. When Sri Lanka imploded in 2022, experts pointed to political instability and poor planning. But what if I told you these weren't isolated failures? What if every single sovereign default in modern history followed the exact same script, written by the same invisible architects? There's a pattern here. And once you see it, you'll never look at national debt the same way again. Today, we're exposing the hidden power brokers who don't just predict defaults, they engineer them and profit massively when nations fall. To understand who's really pulling the strings, we need to go back to 1982, the year modern sovereign debt manipulation became an art form. Mexico was drowning. Oil prices had collapsed, interest rates had skyrocketed, and the country owed over $80 billion to international banks. On August 12th, Mexico's finance minister flew to Washington with a simple message: "We cannot pay." Wall Street panicked. If Mexico defaulted, every major American bank would collapse overnight. But then something remarkable happened. Instead of letting Mexico fail, a new kind of solution emerged, one that would become the blueprint for controlling nations through debt. The International Monetary Fund stepped in, not as a charity, as a loan shark with conditions. They offered Mexico emergency loans, only if the government agreed to something called structural adjustment programs. Privatize your oil. Cut public spending. Open your markets to foreign corporations. Fire government workers. Raise taxes on the poor. Mexico had no choice. They signed. And that's when the pattern began. The rise throughout the 1980s and 90s, this playbook repeated across dozens of countries. Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, Thailand, Russia. Each crisis followed identical steps. First, international banks would flood developing countries with cheap loans. Governments borrowed eagerly to fund infrastructure, social programs, and yes, sometimes corruption. But here's the key. The lenders knew exactly what they were doing. Second, interest rates would suddenly spike, often coordinated by central banks in wealthy nations fighting their own inflation. Overnight, affordable debt became unpayable. Third, as countries struggled, credit rating agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's would downgrade their bonds. This made borrowing even more expensive, creating a death spiral. Fourth, the IMF and World Bank would arrive with rescue packages that weren't rescues at all. They were corporate takeover plans disguised as aid, and who profited? A small group of hedge funds, investment banks, what insiders call vulture funds, financial predators who buy distressed debt for pennies, then sue governments for full repayment plus interest. One fund, Elliott Management, bought defaulted Argentine bonds for $48 million, then sued for $1.6 billion and won. The breaking point, but the most disturbing part, isn't the profit motive, it's the manipulation. In 2010, leaked documents revealed that major banks had actively bet against Greece while publicly claiming to help. Greece hid its true debt levels using complex financial derivatives, then shorted Greek bonds when the scheme collapsed. Translation: they helped create the crisis, then profited from the destruction. When Greece needed a bailout, the conditions were medieval. Pension cuts so severe that suicide rates spiked 35%. Unemployment hit 28%. An entire generation lost. The bailout money, it didn't go to Greek citizens. 95% went directly to French and German banks who had made risky loans. Greece became a colony again, this time owned not by empires but by bondholders. The fallout here is what they don't tell you in economics textbooks. Sovereign defaults aren't accidents. They're engineered outcomes that transfer wealth and power. When a nation defaults, three things always happen. 1. Public assets get privatized at fire sale prices. Water systems, airports, ports, energy grids, all sold to foreign corporations for fractions of their value. 2. Labor protections evaporate. Minimum wages drop. Worker rights vanish. Unions get crushed. 3. Democratic control dissolves. Elected governments become administrators for creditor demands. Now, technocrats appointed by the IMF make the real decisions. This isn't capitalism. This is financial colonialism. And the same players appear in every crisis. The same banks, the same funds, The same IMF officials who rotate between public service and private finance. Modern parallels now look at today's landscape. Pakistan, drowning in IMF conditions while its elite stash wealth in London real estate. Zambia, defaulted in 2020, now being picked apart by Chinese and Western creditors fighting over copper mines. Lebanon, complete economic collapse with banks literally stealing depositors' savings while politicians blame everyone but the system. And here's the terrifying part. Wealthy nations aren't immune anymore. The UK nearly collapsed in 2022 when bond markets revolted against unfunded tax cuts. The Bank of England had to emergency print money to prevent a death spiral. Italy's debt-to-GDP ratio sits at 144%, one bad quarter from crisis. Even the United States, with $34 trillion in debt, only survives because the dollar is the global reserve currency. But that status isn't guaranteed forever. The same vultures are circling, waiting. Takeaways. So, what have we learned? First, sovereign debt isn't just economics. It's a control mechanism. Countries that borrow lose sovereignty to those who lend. Second, defaults don't happen randomly. They're often engineered by the same institutions that profit from the chaos. Create the crisis, offer the solution, extract the wealth. Third, the system isn't designed to help nations recover. It's designed to transfer public wealth into private hands through legal mechanisms that look like rescue operations. Closing warning, here's the question they don't want you asking. If every country is in debt, and the same power brokers always profit from defaults, what happens when they decide it's time for the next wave of collapses? Because the debt levels now, they're exponentially higher than 2008, than 1982, than any point in human history. Someone, somewhere, is looking at a spreadsheet right now, calculating which nation falls next, and how much money they'll make when it does. If this opened your eyes to how the global financial system really works, hit that subscribe button. We're exposing the mechanisms they'd rather keep hidden. Drop a comment with which country's debt crisis you want us to investigate next. And share this with someone who still thinks sovereign defaults are just bad luck. The truth isn't hidden, it's just obscured by complexity. Let's keep making it simple.